On mist-salted coasts where cedar crests looked like dark sails against the sky, a chain of cities clung to the rock and sand as if fastening the land to the sea. Tyre and Sidon, Byblos and Arwad, names like wave beats, opened their harbors at first light, and the Levantine morning poured down in a sheet of hammered gold. It was here, along the narrow ribbon between mountains and water, that a people learned to make horizon their home. From these quays, under the cries of gulls and the perfume of crushed murex shells, the Phoenicians, mariners, traders, makers of signs, stepped into history. The age into which they awakened was not gentle. Around 1200 BCE, the old order of palaces cracked like sun-baked clay, empires dimmed, trade routes faltered, storied ports fell to fire, and the Mediterranean rang with the uncertain thunder of the sea peoples. Yet storms do not only wreck, they reveal. In the ruins of older certainties, new scenes of opportunity opened, and those who knew how to read water, wind, and the wants of strangers could become kings without crowns. The Phoenicians were that kind of people, a tide moving along coastlines, knitting islands and capes into a single cloth of commerce. Stand with them at daybreak. Hear the shipwright's adze ring on cedar rib, feel the plank flex, tight lashed by flax and pitch. In the gloom of the dye works, amphory steam with brine and crushed shell, the future's purple stitched quietly into the present. In alleys of carved limestone, merchants unfurl cloth and stories, tin from the Atlantic fog, ebony from the upper Nile, glass that catches the sun and throws it back in shards of sky. Priests kindle dawn incense to Baal Shamum, Lord of the heavens, and to Lady Astarte whose stars turn sailors home. Somewhere a scribe touches a stylus to a potsherd and draws a sign that is not a picture of a thing but the sound of a breath, and the world becomes more speakable. The land itself shaped them. A long, thin Levant, mountains shouldering the sea, valleys opening like flutes, taught economy and audacity. Fields were few, trees many, harbors excellent. The sea offered space where the land refused it, the wind offered speed where armies would have offered fear. So they built light-boned ships with high, proud prows, moved by oars and square sails that snapped like banners in an evening breeze. They learned the paths of currents the way shepherds know goat paths, tested channels with lead lines, and let the coast be a sentence they could read in cliffs and coves. They became interpreters of weather and customs, of tempers and tastes, translating desires between shores. Chronicles do not begin with fanfare, they begin with habits. The habit of leaving and returning. Of weighing, sealing, tallying, of speaking to strangers in their tongue. Of making offerings before a voyage and vows after a safe landfall. Of keeping knowledge quiet, reefs, winds, suppliers, as if secrets themselves were cargo. In time the habit accumulates into history. By the late 12th and 11th centuries BCE, while great kingdoms still blinked in the smoke of collapse, Phoenician quays were busy again, timber stacked for rafts to Egypt, fine linen packed for Cyprus, ingots of copper and the rumor of iron moving through ledgers like a new planet through star charts. There is a rhythm to their world, a call and response of waves and cities. The sea asks, "What do you bring?" They answer, "Cedar, glass, purple, words." The sea asks again, "And what do you seek?" They say, "Silver, tin, quiet harbors, and treaties that last longer than storms." The sea asks a third time, "What do you leave behind?" They smile, colonies lighted like constellations, contracts scratched into wax and clay, and an alphabet, portable law of sound, that any tongue can make its own. Place it in time. Around 1100 BCE, Sidon and Tyre jostle for preeminence. Byblos, old friend of Egypt, still sends raft loads of cedar down to Nile deltas where lotus and papyrus sway. On Cyprus, smelting fires breathe day and night. On Crete, the memory of palaces glows like embers. On Rhodes, harbors weigh each passing hull. Inevitably, routes lengthen. The Levant to Aegean run becomes a Levant-Aegean-Ionian-Tyrrhenian loop. Then, with daring, a run past the pillars of Melkart, Heracles to the Greeks, into Atlantic waters where the sky feels larger and the sun lingers as if surprised by so much west. The Phoenicians prosper not by demanding the world become like them, but by learning what the world already desires. In Sardinia, they discover a hunger for crafted metal and protective gods with sailor eyes. In Iberia, the rivers run with silver and the mountains hide tin in blue-gray veins. In North Africa, lagoons offer salt as clean as new snow, and capes curve like palms beckoning a safe night's sleep. They are gentle where gain is gentle, sharp where danger requires edge. They do not need to conquer to rule, because markets are their provinces and contracts their walls. Listen for the gods in this. Melkart, the king of Tyre, patron of voyages, strides in hearts and figureheads. His club and lion lurk on coins and seals, quiet emblems of a power that is everywhere and nowhere. A starred star glitters above prow and temple alike, binding fertility to enterprise and love to oath. Eshman watches over healers and cutters of cedar. Reshepher's fiery arrows remind captains not to defy plague quarters and quarantine rules the priests pronounce with grave, practical care. Religion, in this world, is not only awe but logistics sanctified, calendars set for sailing seasons, festivals timed to the pulse of winds, vows linked to insurance before the word was born. And then, the alphabet. Not all revolutions shout. Some fit in the palm and travel in a pocket. Once, when scribes painted gods and bulls and rivers to trap a name, writing was heavy, priestly, palace-bound. The Phoenicians took the soundscape of speech and broke it into a modest company of signs, around 24 shapes, each standing for a consonant's bone. Aleph, the ox's head tilted, Bet, a house, Gimel, a camel in swift reduction. Pictures, yes, but pictures cut so thin they became pure function. With reeds and ink, with stylus and wax, traders could now net the exact breadth of a contract, sailors could list cargo without palace schools, strangers could learn the set and keep the tune. From Levantine docks this simple, stubborn grace traveled like a rumor people wanted to believe, that words could be owned by anyone who cared to learn them. See now how the coast looks from offshore at dusk. The mountains go purple, and the harbors light themselves one by one, a string of embers from Arwad to Dor. Somewhere a child on a breakwater counts ships and dreams of far islands with names that sound like the hiss of surf. Somewhere an old pilot draws charts in his head, where a dark patch on the sea is not shadow but weed bed, where a pale slash is not light but reef. Somewhere a woman sets a loom and throws a shuttle and hears in its click the footfalls of sailors returning. The cities lean into the sea and the sea leans back, in that leaning is a century's worth of balance. Violence is never far. Pirates knife the calm, storms turn harbors into dice games, a bad season upriver starves plains and makes men cruel. But the Phoenicians have a way of sliding between the weights of others. When Philistines press along the southern coast, they switch harbors. When Aramean levies choke inland routes, they load more decks. When a great king to the north demands tribute, they invent gifts that feel like honor and price them like salvation. Practicality blooms into a kind of art, the art of surviving the ambitions of others. By the centuries turn toward 1000 BCE, the pattern holds. The sea is the field, ships are plows, emporia are harvest barns. In Tyre, a double city, old rock and island, rises like a twin-hearted fortress. In Sidon, glass furnaces murmur and blowers' cheeks swell with wind. In Byblos, scribes still nod toward Egypt even as ledgers tilt west. Out beyond the familiar, scouts not new waypoints into the net, Gadir on the ocean's lip, Utica on Africa's curve, Lixus where river meets tide, and legends say a garden of apples once glowed with impossible light. The Phoenicians mark those places not with bronze tablets but with habits, pilots who know the sandbar, hosts who know what wine to pour for which tongue. And in the spaces between ports, language continues its quiet conquest. Greeks pick up the signs and give them vowels like lamps in a dark house. Italians pick up the Greeks and pass them along. Islands teach the mainland and back again. The alphabet spreads the way good tools spread, by proving itself on ordinary days. Meanwhile, in the dye vats, a million shellfish bleed a thread of royal dusk, and robes go out to kings who cannot imagine power without that shade. Meanwhile, in the timber yards, cedar ribs for palaces and hulls lie side by side as if architecture and voyaging were twins waiting to be born again. They say that when the wind goes slack at noon off Tyre, the water goes so clear you can count the anchor stones of sunken ships from years when the harbor lay closer to the sky. History is like that water, a lens, a lull. Look down through it, and you can see silhouettes of what will come, Assyrian scales weighing tribute, Babylonian banners over siege mounds, Persian triremes braiding the sea into imperial lanes. And further still, a figure in a lion-fringed cloak, a king with a quick smile and a quicker march, will throw a causeway into the water and turn an island into a promontory. But for now, in this first light, the Phoenicians stand at the shore's edge with ropes in their hands and maps in their heads, and the horizon is open as a promise. The sea breathes. The cities answer. From 1200 to 1000 BCE, a people made of harbors and hulls learned to live by reading the world as if it were written for them. And perhaps, in a way, it was, for they were the ones who taught the world how to be written. Before the alphabet fit into a palm and the purple of kings bled from shell to cloth, there were older footsteps along the Levant's narrow ledges. They left sherds in the dirt and lintels on the hills, and the wind still reads them. On slopes where rain comes like a visitor and departs without apology, where limestone drinks light and exudes coolness, small villages learned first to bind themselves to springs and then to the sea. Long before 1200 BCE, the coast had already been a braid of paths and coves. By circa 3200 to 2800 BCE the cedar stands above Byblos, Gubler to its own people, Jebel to neighbors, were moving down the shore as raft, beam, rib. Egypt's old kingdom needed wood the Nile could not grow, and Byblos had trees that reached like prayers. Between c. 2600 and 2200 BCE, entire seasons were measured in cedar convoys sliding south, trunks lashed together, pilots watching the color of water and the angle of swells, bargemen making offerings to a lady they called Baalat Jebel, the mistress of Byblos, whom visiting Egyptians recognized with a shock of familiarity as their own Atha in a foreign dress. This is how origins work on the Levantine coast, not with creation out of nothing, but with recognition across currents. A shrine becomes a temple because merchants keep their promises. A local goddess acquires foreign epithets because sailors sleep more easily under a name the wind already knows. A word for harbor begins to sound like a word for home. In layers of packed earth at Byblos, at Sidon, at Tyre's older mainland quarters, archaeologists find foundations that remember bronze before iron, amphorae that remember resin before wine. Even to the north at Ugarit, where the 14th to 13th centuries BCE kept clay libraries near the thunder of surf, the tablets whisper an alphabetic instinct, a way of pinning sound to sign tighter and faster than palace scripts were willing to allow. An undeciphered syllabary at Byblos, an alphabet in cuneiform dress at Ugarit, the pulse of Egyptian and Mesopotamian systems through busy hands, all of it was prelude, rehearsal, breath drawn before the Phoenician stroke wrote the sea in 20-some signs. But the land said first what was possible. A mountain chain, Lebanon and anti-Lebanon, runs close to the shore, wringing winter rain out of passing clouds and releasing it in abrupt green flares, olives with their gray undersides flickering like fish scales, vines teaching stone to taste sun, barley making a thin gold on terraced ribs. Summer bakes, winter storms remember how to break ships. Deep natural roads of water open where headlands hook the sea, sheltering inlets invite human stubbornness. In such a place, agriculture supports families and courage supports cities. Timber is the dowry, stone the backbone, salt the memory, and fish the daily grammar. Storms out of the west make a calendar, Etesian winds farther north draw lines across months, currents and countercurrents teach that the Mediterranean has moods, and that those moods can be read. The people who would be called Phoenicians, Canaanites by tongue and soil, Phoenicians by their dealings and the dye that stained their fingers, learned young to be translators. They translated mountain into mast and resin into sealant, converted distant hunger into the right cargo and local surplus into treaty. The Bronze Age world before c. 1200 BCE already knew their harbors as places where things came true, ebony from the lands of the Upper Nile, lapis coldnite from beyond the rivers of the east, copper from Cyprus's lungs, tin from the smoky ends of maps, or so it felt, where fog learned the taste of salt. The Uluburun wreck of the 14th century BCE, adowned elsewhere but sprung from this same economy, was like a cross-section of the age, ingots that gleamed like frozen sunlight, jars that smelled of resin and pistachio, ivory that remembered the savannah, glass that held captive pieces of dawn. Even if that ship sailed under a different flag, its logic was familiar in Sidon's counting houses and Tyre's yards. Myth kept pace with ledger. They told how Europe herself, Europa, had been carried westward from Sidon's sands, a story the Greeks loved to tell as if the continent needed a Phoenician origin to explain its thirst for coasts. They told how Cadmos left Tyre following a stolen sister and, never finding her, taught letters to the places he did find, sowing both teeth and scripts into foreign soil. They told how Melkart, Tyre's hero and god, founded cities by staking fire into the ground and claiming the circle of its warmth for law. When strangers came, they recognized the silhouettes, Melkart and Heracles nodding to each other across cultures like seasoned captains passing in a narrow strait. Between c. 1800 and 1200 BCE, as palaces rose and fell in the great lands to the east and south, these coastal towns learned to keep their gods portable, an altar that could be reconstructed, a ritual that could travel, a vow that could be honored with a cargo delivered on time. Climate pressed them into craft. Cedar, yes, with its straight, fragrant grain and resistance to rot, but also juniper and pine for oars and spars, flax and papyrus for cordage and sail, woven mats for shade on decks where bronze winked and tar sighed. Shipwrights in coves worked shell-first, planks joined by mortise and tenon, pegged so tight that seams were as discreet as good secrets. Keels carried a memory of rivers, prows curled like the ram's own horn, eyes were painted on bows not for superstition alone but to remind the ship she had a face to show the world and a direction to look. By circa 1300 to 1200 BCE the silhouettes were reliable, a merchantman with its stout belly for amphory, an oared galley with a square sail for generosity and a beam for stability. Navigation was apprenticeship before it was instrument, a star angled off a mast, a swell remembered in the feet, a smell of land braided with a certain color of water, a gull's behavior near dusk. Archaeology has the patience to hear such skills through stone. In Sidon's tombs, gold and faience travel farther than the bodies they mourn. In Byblos's temple precincts, stelae carry hieroglyphs that took ship for the occasion and never went home. The soil keeps ledgers better than kings. Clay ceilings impressed by foreign rings lie in heaps by doorways where scribes once counted and grinned. Weights of standardized shape bear incised marks that hint at those early, spare signs, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, on their way to abstraction. By the time the 12th century BCE throws sparks from the collapse of old powers, the coast's people are already fluent in adjustment. They have practiced for generations the art of continuing when bigger neighbors stumble. An origin is not a single date, it is a cadence. Between c. 1500 and 1200 BCE, the cadence quickens. Hittite pressure to the north squeezes trade south and over water. Egypt's own pendulum swings between vigor and retreat. Inland routes through the Jordan highlands and the Bekaa shift with political weather. The coast answers not with armies but with sailings. Crews get used to island runs, Cyprus to Rhodes to Crete to the Peloponnese, and equally to the boldness of a direct fetch when wind permits. Contracts written on wax tablets go in oilskin pouches, duplicates in clay go into storerooms, the truly vital bits live in memory and in the fibers of kinship. A mother's brother in Sidon will vouch for a loan, a cousin indoor will ensure a risky cargo with an oath before the god, an in-law in Egypt will grease the dockyard's curiosity with the right gift. When the storm breaks after 1200 BCE, this web does not tear, it tightens. It tightens because the sea is there, indifferent and available. Summer, a highway, winter, a counted risk. It tightens because the mountains refuse to widen fields, and families with ambition need volume that only hulls can provide. It tightens because a culture that has learned to mix reverence with pragmatism can burn incense in the morning and haggle by noon without feeling torn. The priests are not enemies of the merchants, they are their actuaries. Sail after the festival of the first fruits, they say, for the winds will remember their obligations. Quarantine the crew, they say, for Resheph has been seen in the lower quarter. They name the gods of disease, storm, fertility, an oath, and in naming, they administer risk. When the great unthreading comes, city after city inland and across the sea emptied by fire, faction, famine, the coastal towns are bruised but not broken. In the decade circa 1200 to 1100 BCE, workshops reopen, not out of stubborn romance but because customers are hungry again. Tin must still meet copper to make bronze where iron has not yet learned manners, cedar must still frame palaces in lands where forests have been oversung, glass trinkets must still mimic sky in hands that cannot command real heaven. Sidon recovers, Tyre rises on its island like a lesson in humility pitched to besiegers who think land is always the answer. Byblos, old and reputable, nods to Egypt and to whatever power next holds the inland roads. New colonies, more accurately, new extensions of habit, are planted on friendly shores, north to Arwad Salt, south to Dawes Curve, west to Cyprus where copper is a god with red hands. And in the midst of repairs and ventures, the alphabet walks out of workshops and onto the decks. It is spare and sturdy like the ships that carry it. A reed pen can learn it in an afternoon, a boy can scratch it into a potsherd and learn to speak in writing without servants of the temple or palace looking over his shoulder. Around c. 1050 to 950 BCE the inscriptions we can still touch settle into their shapes, not picture words piled into monuments, but breath notes lined up like oars. The signs are few because the sounds are many and human mouths do the rest. Traders love it, sailors love it, foreign receivers of cargo love it more. It is not a pose to say that this script democratized remembering, it is a ledger to say that it cut costs. How do we know origins are secure? Because later glories sit on them without falling through. When Tyre begins to outstrip her sisters in the 10th century BCE, the shipyards she expands were already measured in the century before. When purple becomes the shade that kings demand, the murex heaps had already taught the city how to live with the stench that money makes. When treaties with inland kings are signed with confident hands, the habit of making such treaties on equal footing is already older than most reigns. The alphabet, carried to Greek harbors where it receives the gift of bright vowels, becomes a divining rod for poetry and philosophy. Carried farther still to Italian peninsulas, it learns jurisprudence and builds empires on paper before they exist in stone. But all that is later. Here, in the centuries flanking 1200 BCE, the coast is finishing its long rehearsal and stepping onto a stage entered by accident, ready for performance. Stand once more in Byblos at first rain after the dry months. The scent of dust learning water is older than any dynasty. A merchant runs his thumb along a beam and knows it holds, a priest cups his hand around a flame to keep it steady in the gust, a girl pushes a stylus into wax and copies a list of amphorae by sound alone, smiling at a trick that feels like magic and responsibility at once. Out in the roads, ships swing at anchor, their reflections trembling as if impatient. Sidon, Tyre, Arwad, Dor, they have always been there in potential, but now their names begin to be verbs. To Tyre is to island yourself against force, to Sidon is to furnish and refine, to Byblos is to remember, record, and trade with the great river's people, to Arwad is to live by the logic of waves. Origins become habits, habits become character. Even the gods adjust. Bullshamam's sky bends over wider circuits, Astarte star finds herself not only above orchards but above open water, where the line between fertility and fortune is very thin. Melkart's lion looks down from prows that have touched coasts whose languages do not yet have a word for him, and yet those coasts will find room for his altars because he understands something universal, a fire kept through night, a boundary walked and claimed, a traveler welcomed because he brings news as valuable as goods. So by the time our calendar of concern properly opens, 1200 to 1000 BCE already told, and the next centuries waiting, the roots are sunk deep. Archaeologists' spades and picks have tasted the strata, myths have braided east and west, climate has forged a people who mistake neither calm sea for safety nor rough weather for doom. The alphabet is poised like a bird about to lift, the shipyards smell of pitch and cedar, the dye vats glisten with that improbable dust that will drape senators and emperors in centuries yet to come. The coast has learned how to be narrow without being small. And somewhere in the imagined future of these origins, a causeway will march across the water toward an island city that thought itself impregnable, and a Macedonian king will learn what siege means when the besieged are born of the sea. But that is for later. For now, the past tightens like a well-made knot, and the Levantine morning opens again, confident that the people who rose from its stones and tides know exactly how to begin. Before the alphabet fit into a palm and the purple of kings bled from shell to cloth, there were older footsteps along the Levant's narrow ledges. They left sherds in the dirt and lintels on the hills, and the wind still reads them. On slopes where rain comes like a visitor and departs without apology, where limestone drinks light and exudes coolness, small villages learned first to bind themselves to springs and then to the sea. Long before 1200 BCE, the coast had already been a braid of paths and coves. By circa 3200 to 2800 BCE the cedar stands above Byblos, Gubbler to its own people, Jebel to neighbors, were moving down the shore as raft, beam, rib. Egypt's old kingdom needed wood the Nile could not grow, and Byblos had trees that reached like prayers. Between c. 2600 and 2200 BCE, entire seasons were measured in cedar convoys sliding south, trunks lashed together, pilots watching the color of water and the angle of swells, bargemen making offerings to a lady they called Baal Jebel, the mistress of Byblos, whom visiting Egyptians recognized with a shock of familiarity as their own Atha in a foreign dress. This is how origins work on the Levantine coast, not with creation out of nothing, but with recognition across currents. A shrine becomes a temple because merchants keep their promises. A local goddess acquires foreign epithets because sailors sleep more easily under a name the wind already knows. A word for harbor begins to sound like a word for home. In layers of packed earth at Byblos, at Sidon, at Tyre's older mainland quarters, archaeologists find foundations that remember bronze before iron, amphorae that remember resin before wine. Even to the north at Ugarit, where the 14th to 13th centuries BCE kept clay libraries near the thunder of surf, the tablets whisper an alphabetic instinct, a way of pinning sound to sign tighter and faster than palace scripts were willing to allow. An undeciphered syllabary at Byblos, an alphabet in cuneiform dress at Ugarit, the pulse of Egyptian and Mesopotamian systems through busy hands, All of it was prelude, rehearsal, breath drawn before the Phoenician stroke wrote the sea in 20-some signs. But the land said first what was possible. A mountain chain, Lebanon and anti-Lebanon, runs close to the shore, wringing winter rain out of passing clouds and releasing it in abrupt green flares, olives with their grey undersides flickering like fish scales, vines teaching stone to taste sun, barley making a thin gold on terraced ribs. Summer bakes, winter storms remember how to break ships. Deep natural roads of water open where headlands hook the sea, sheltering inlets invite human stubbornness. In such a place, agriculture supports families and courage supports cities. Timber is the dowry, stone the backbone, salt the memory, and fish the daily grammar. Storms out of the west make a calendar, Etesian winds farther north draw lines across months, currents and countercurrents teach that the Mediterranean has moods, and that those moods can be read. The people who would be called Phoenicians, Canaanites by tongue and soil, Phoenicians by their dealings and the dye that stained their fingers, learned young to be translators. They translated mountain into mast and resin into sealant, converted distant hunger into the right cargo and local surplus into treaty. The Bronze Age world before c. 1200 BCE already knew their harbors as places where things came true, ebony from the lands of the Upper Nile, lapis coldnite from beyond the rivers of the east, copper from Cyprus's lungs, tin from the smoky ends of maps, or so it felt, where fog learned the taste of salt. The Uluburun wreck of the 14th century BCE, adowned elsewhere but sprung from this same economy, was like a cross-section of the age, ingots that gleamed like frozen sunlight, jars that smelled of resin and pistachio, ivory that remembered the savannah, glass that held captive pieces of dawn. Even if that ship sailed under a different flag, its logic was familiar in Sidon's counting houses and Tyre's yards. Myth kept pace with ledger. They told how Europe herself, Europa, had been carried westward from Sidon's sands, a story the Greeks loved to tell as if the continent needed a Phoenician origin to explain its thirst for coasts. They told how Cadmos left Tyre following a stolen sister and, never finding her, taught letters to the places he did find, sowing both teeth and scripts into foreign soil. They told how Melkart, Tyre's hero and god, founded cities by staking fire into the ground and claiming the circle of its warmth for law. When strangers came, they recognized the silhouettes, Melkart and Heracles nodding to each other across cultures like seasoned captains passing in a narrow strait. Between c. 1800 and 1200 BCE, as palaces rose and fell in the great lands to the east and south, these coastal towns learned to keep their gods portable, an altar that could be reconstructed, a ritual that could travel, a vow that could be honored with a cargo delivered on time. Climate pressed them into craft. Cedar, yes, with its straight, fragrant grain and resistance to rot, but also juniper and pine for oars and spars, flax and papyrus for cordage and sail, woven mats for shade on decks where bronze winked and tar sighed. Shipwrights in coves worked shell first, planks joined by mortise and tenon, pegged so tight that seams were as discreet as good secrets. Keels carried a memory of rivers, prows curled like the ram's own horn, eyes were painted on bows not for superstition alone but to remind the ship she had a face to show the world and a direction to look. By circa 1300 to 1200 BCE the silhouettes were reliable, a merchantman with its stout belly for amphory, an oared galley with a square sail for generosity and a beam for stability. Navigation was apprenticeship before it was instrument, a star angled off a mast, a swell remembered in the feet, a smell of land braided with a certain color of water, a gull's behavior near dusk. Archaeology has the patience to hear such skills through stone. In Sidon's tombs, gold and faience travel farther than the bodies they mourn. In Byblos's temple precincts, stelae carry hieroglyphs that took ship for the occasion and never went home. The soil keeps ledgers better than kings. Clay ceilings impressed by foreign rings lie in heaps by doorways where scribes once counted and grinned. Weights of standardized shape bear incised marks that hint at those early, spare signs, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, on their way to abstraction. By the time the 12th century BCE throws sparks from the collapse of old powers, the coast's people are already fluent in adjustment. They have practiced for generations the art of continuing when bigger neighbors stumble. An origin is not a single date, it is a cadence. Between c. 1500 and 1200 BCE, the cadence quickens. Hittite pressure to the north squeezes trade south and over water. Egypt's own pendulum swings between vigor and retreat. Inland routes through the Jordan highlands and the Bekaa shift with political weather. The coast answers not with armies but with sailings. Crews get used to island runs, Cyprus to Rhodes to Crete to the Peloponnese, and equally to the boldness of a direct fetch when wind permits. Contracts written on wax tablets go in oilskin pouches, duplicates in clay go into storerooms. The truly vital bits live in memory and in the fibers of kinship. A mother's brother in Sidon will vouch for a loan, a cousin indoor will insure a risky cargo with an oath before the god, an in-law in Egypt will grease the dockyard's curiosity with the right gift. When the storm breaks after 1200 BCE, this web does not tear, it tightens. It tightens because the sea is there, indifferent and available. Summer, a highway, winter, a counted risk. It tightens because the mountains refuse to widen fields, and families with ambition need volume that only hulls can provide. It tightens because a culture that has learned to mix reverence with pragmatism can burn incense in the morning and haggle by noon without feeling torn. The priests are not enemies of the merchants, they are their actuaries. Sail after the festival of the first fruits, they say, for the winds will remember their obligations. Quarantine the crew, they say, for Reshef has been seen in the lower quarter. They name the gods of disease, storm, fertility, an oath, and in naming, they administer risk. When the great unthreading comes, city after city inland and across the sea emptied by fire, faction, famine, the coastal towns are bruised but not broken. In the decade circa 1200 to 1100 BCE, workshops reopen, not out of stubborn romance but because customers are hungry again. Tin must still meet copper to make bronze where iron has not yet learned manners. Cedar must still frame palaces in lands where forests have been oversung. Glass trinkets must still mimic sky in hands that cannot command real heaven. Sidon recovers, Tyre rises on its island like a lesson in humility pitched to besiegers who think land is always the answer. Byblos, old and reputable, nods to Egypt and to whatever power next holds the inland roads. New colonies, more accurately, new extensions of habit, are planted on friendly shores, north to Arwad Salt, south to Dawes Curve, west to Cyprus where copper is a god with red hands. And in the midst of repairs and ventures, the alphabet walks out of workshops and onto the decks. It is spare and sturdy like the ships that carry it. A reed pen can learn it in an afternoon, a boy can scratch it into a potsherd and learn to speak in writing without servants of the temple or palace looking over his shoulder. Around c. 1050 to 950 BCE the inscriptions we can still touch settle into their shapes, not picture words piled into monuments, but breath notes lined up like oars. The signs are few because the sounds are many and human mouths do the rest. Traders love it, sailors love it, foreign receivers of cargo love it more. It is not a pose to say that this script democratized remembering, it is a ledger to say that it cut costs. How do we know origins are secure? Because later glories sit on them without falling through. When Tyre begins to outstrip her sisters in the 10th century BCE, the shipyards she expands were already measured in the century before. When purple becomes the shade that kings demand, the murex heaps had already taught the city how to live with the stench that money makes. When treaties with inland kings are signed with confident hands, the habit of making such treaties on equal footing is already older than most reigns. The alphabet, carried to Greek harbors where it receives the gift of bright vowels, becomes a divining rod for poetry and philosophy. Carried farther still to Italian peninsulas, it learns jurisprudence and builds empires on paper before they exist in stone. But all that is later. Here, in the centuries flanking 1200 BCE, the coast is finishing its long rehearsal and stepping onto a stage entered by accident, ready for performance. Stand once more in Byblos at first rain after the dry months. The scent of dust learning water is older than any dynasty. A merchant runs his thumb along a beam and knows it holds, a priest cups his hand around a flame to keep it steady in the gust, a girl pushes a stylus into wax and copies a list of amphorae by sound alone, smiling at a trick that feels like magic and responsibility at once. Out in the roads, ships swing at anchor, their reflections trembling as if impatient. Sidon, Tyre, Arwad, Dor, they have always been there in potential, but now their names begin to be verbs. To Tyre is to island yourself against force, to Sidon is to furnish and refine, to Byblos is to remember, record, and trade with the great river's people, to Arwad is to live by the logic of waves. Origins become habits, habits become character. Even the gods are just. Bullshamam's sky bends over wider circuits, a start star finds herself not only above orchards but above open water, where the line between fertility and fortune is very thin. Melkart's lion looks down from prows that have touched coasts whose languages do not yet have a word for him, and yet those coasts will find room for his altars because he understands something universal, a fire kept through night, a boundary walked and claimed, a traveler welcomed because he brings news as valuable as goods. So by the time our calendar of concern properly opens, 1200 to 1000 BCE already told, and the next centuries waiting, the roots are sunk deep. Archaeologists' spades and picks have tasted the strata, myths have braided east and west, climate has forged a people who mistake neither calm sea for safety nor rough weather for doom. The alphabet is poised like a bird about to lift, the shipyards smell of pitch and cedar, the dye vats glisten with that improbable dust that will drape senators and emperors in centuries yet to come. The coast has learned how to be narrow without being small. And somewhere in the imagined future of these origins, a causeway will march across the water toward an island city that thought itself impregnable, and a Macedonian king will learn what siege means when the besieged are born of the sea. But that is for later. For now, the past tightens like a well-made knot, and the Levantine morning opens again, confident that the people who rose from its stones and tides know exactly how to begin. At the waterline, work divides itself like currents. There are those who own hulls and those who pull them, those who count and those who carry, those who bless the venture and those who dive for what turns breath into money. In a city like Tyre or Sidon, power begins with families whose names are as old as certain peers, households that can summon credit with a nod. Their courtyards are paved in cool stone, their ledgers smell of cedar chests and oil, their sons learn early how to weigh a promise and their daughters how to command a house that is also an office. They sponsor voyages, underwrite risk, endow a shrine's lamp so that the light that protects their ships will not go out. Beside them stand the shipbuilders, masters of ribs and planks, whose decisions are quiet and irrevocable, and the skippers whose faces the wind has carved into maps. Below them in rank but never in skill are the makers, glass that captures a drop of sky and refuses to let it spill, bronze that holds an edge through salt and time, linen that knows how to fall over a shoulder with just enough weight to remind the wearer of its worth. Guilds form as naturally as knots, the casters, the blowers, the weavers, the cord makers, the caulkers who carry pitch black shine under their nails like a badge. Their gods are practical, a shrine at the yard gate, a lamp before a small image that smells of resin and hot iron, an oath murmured to the god who minds fingers near the fire. Between warehouse and wharf move the carriers, men whose backs are the bridges between ledgers, boys whose legs are quick with messages, women whose baskets make markets possible and whose pricing can pinch or widen a household's winter. Divers are their own nation. They walk the pier with stone weights slung like babies on their chests, the ropes around their waists coiled like tame snakes, their ears trained to pressure more than to speech. When they drop, the world collapses to breath, color, touch, the purple-bearing murex found by feel among rocks with the tide chewing at silence. They come up with shells that will stain the year, they come up sometimes too fast, dizzy with the sea's rough arithmetic, they eat well in season and pray carefully out of it. Slaves are here too, and freedmen. Some are debtors whose bad year lasts longer than it should, some are prisoners of war taken inland and sold coastward, some are born to the status and learn from childhood the art of being invisible and indispensable. A good household frees those who make themselves useful and loyal, a bad one spends them like rope. Freedmen often keep to the trades they learned in bondage and do well, because skill is a kind of passport and Phoenician cities love a passport. On feast days even the least of them tastes good wine, because the gods are to be thanked with generosity that smells like abundance. Above all, priests and priestesses stitch heaven to habit. In Tyre, Melkart's sacred precinct breathes cedar and sea salt, his image carries the calm of strength that does not need to be announced. He is founder and fire, the god who made a city by driving a stake into the ground and claiming the circle of its warmth, the god who accompanies voyages because a city made of voyages needs its first light kept alive in foreign mornings. In Sidon, Eshmon's sanctuary gardens hold medicinal quietude, water steps gently through basins where the sick wash away the worst of their fear, physicians trace lineage through the god the way shipwrights trace it through techniques. A start, Brighton men inaimed, owns both orchard and offshore, fertility of field and womb, yes, but also the humbler, sharper fertility of making money breed money, of cargo arriving whole, of marriages that knit houses into networks. Bulshamam's sky is the roof of every oath, Reshefa's quick heat enforces quarantine with divine severity, Dagon and Yam belong to older conversations with grain and sea that never really stop. Ritual is not display alone. It is law with perfume. Before a voyage, the captain stands with his back to the harbor and his face to the god. He names the ship, the cargo, the crew by number, and he names the winds by their pet names, the winds that come willing and those that sulk. He promises a lamp, a plaque, a silver model of a ship the length of his forearm, should prophet return with him. He promises, too, to remember the god abroad, to burn incense in sanctuaries that share the same family of divinity even if the tongue is different. After safe arrival, he keeps the vow, because reputation sits upon the shoulders of gods and men alike. Contracts smell of oil and wax. Two men sit cross-legged, a scribe between them like a keel between banks of oars. He writes, who gives and who receives, how long the voyage, what share of profit belongs to hull and what to cargo, what becomes of the copper if the tin does not meet it at the appointed place, who pays if a god takes offense. A witness list pricks the clay with names, a seal rolls across the wet rectangle like a plowed field. Copies are made, one for each party, one for the shrine that offers arbitration if the sea teaches the contract humility. In the sanctuaries, a small room holds shelves with clay envelopes impressed by seals. The god is a notary with lightning. Domestic life is a measured abundance. The house turns around a courtyard, with shade at noon and stars at night. A granary jar sits like a fat ant in a cool corner, a loom sings in a room that smells of fibers and patience, a water jar sweats its steady truth. Children learn letters by scratching them on ostraca, the broken pottery shards that turn trash into school. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, ox, house, camel, pictures that are not pictures anymore, sounds held in the fingers. Boys often go to sea too young and return older than their fathers, girls marry into neighborhoods that already know their mothers, widows keep businesses alive with a competence the men learn to respect because the numbers never lie. The law allows women to own property, to serve as priestesses, to witness contracts, not a utopia by the measure of our own, a flexibility by the measure of its time. Clothing talks money. Undyed linen moves like water, wool keeps its promises in winter, belts carry knives and keys and memory. Purple is not merely expensive, it is intentional. To wear it is to say that relationships are already adjusted around you. But purple is less common than loyalty. A cloak thrown over a friend at the marketplace so that he can bargain without showing the foreign cut of his tunic, that is the real currency. Hospitality is a civic virtue and a business plan. In a port city, the stranger in your doorway might be your cousin's partner's brother. He might also be the one who tells you that the price of tin has gone strange in the far west. Bread, salt, and clean water are never wasted on the wrong man. Festivals organize the year the way constellations organize the night. In early spring, prayers for steady winds braid with prayers for fig blossom. In high summer, Melkart's fire walks the city's edges and is renewed. In autumn, the first press of olives darkens the hands of those who bring bowls to the shrine. War and peace are marked with the same gestures, a libation on the threshold, a wreath on a door, a lock of hair offered for a son going out to sea. Funeral processions are modest or rich, but all of them end where the city keeps its dead, a necropolis cut into rock like a continuation of streets, with goods that tell the living what the dead valued, a small jar of unguent, a seal, a coin later ages will call Charon's fee. The underworld is understood less as terror than as contract, the living owe the dead remembrance, the dead owe the living a slow, untroublesome fade. Symbols proliferate because trade moves meanings as well as goods. In Carthage, the sign of tarnet, triangle and bar and circle, blossoms like a shorthand for favor. In Tyre, the club and lion of Melkart speak across coin faces to cities that call the same figure Heracles. Harbors pick up a habit of displaying eyes on prows, a tradition that feels as old as fear. Amulets shaped like hands, fish, scarabs, cuneiform ideograms turned into jewelry, all of them mediate between worlds with the good manners of the well-traveled. Law grows out of custom and into confidence. Assault is punished because ships cannot sail if crews are busy fighting each other. Theft is punished because margins are narrow and trust is slower to grow than rumor. Interest rates learn to be stern rather than cruel. Debt bondage has doors that open both ways. Orphans find patrons at shrines because the god's honor is entangled with the safety of those who can't pay for defenders. Litigation is a local art, and arbitrators are chosen for their capacity to say no without breeding feud. The alphabet helps. Testimony written and sealed is harder to twist than memory alone, and an oath tablet has a god behind it like a shadow. Education is apprenticeship. A boy set at a counting board becomes a man who can price a cargo in 3 currencies. A girl set at a loom becomes a woman whose fabrics are better than dowry. They are contacts, sold for favors that recur. A young diver learns to love the slow, planned breath. A young pilot learns the sea's temperaments as if they were neighbors. A scribe moves between households like a bee, and what he carries is as sweet as honey and as binding as wax. Foreigners are not simply tolerated, they are necessary. Greeks come to buy and sell and stay to teach a reading of stars different enough to be useful. Egyptians bring priests learning and take back cedar for gods who hate low ceilings. Inland Arameans bring wool and realize that the sea is a caravan that costs less to feed. At times the city seems like a pact between accents. Marriages seal understandings that treaties applaud. Children grow up tasting garlic 3 ways and naming the same star in 2 tongues. There is prejudice, of course, and pride. There is also the stubborn intelligence of people who know their bread comes buttered by variety. The army, when it appears, is a rearrangement of the port. Galleys lose their cargo and gain their teeth. Men who lifted amphorae lift shields. Archers who hunted birds in salt marshes put down rioters on quays. Mercenaries are hired because a city that must keep making and trading cannot always spare its makers and traders for fields far away. Inland kings learn to respect cities that can close their harbors like a fist. Siege is the nightmare. Siege means someone else has decided to slow time to a crawl. In such seasons, religion and rationing are the same art. Women grind grain with patience that is half prayer. Men patrol walls that are stone one day and dream the next. Children learn the mathematics of portions. The best cities learn how to be islands even when they sit on a mainland. the best islands learn how to be continents of resourcefulness. Rumor is the other army. A whisper can move prices faster than a north wind moves sailcloth. The city employs its own listeners, men who seem idle but hear everything, women at wells whose tongues are clean and quick. When Assyria flexes, the price of silence goes up. When Babylon yawns, interest eases. When Persia measures the world and finds it worthy of roads and rates, coin triumphs over barter in entire categories of life. Money talks a new grammar, the alphabet writes it down. There are shadows in every society, and here the darkest gather around how gift, vow, and life sometimes entangle. In certain precincts of the West, archaeologists will later argue over evidence, charred bones, urns, inscriptions, about whether vows demanded the lives of the very young in extremity, whether the thanks offered for victory or safe return could be as terrible as grief itself. The truth may be tangled in practice and polemic. What matters here is that the cities were capable of thinking of offerings as more than words. They believed that bargains with gods were real and that breaking them invited a flood no wall could hold. It made them cautious with promises and honest with what they laid on altars. And yet, most days, society is not a debate, it is a practice. A fish market at mid-morning smells like the sea turning its pockets inside out. A classroom in a scribe's house echoes with the scratch of stylus and the sigh of a boy who cannot make his aleph sit straight. A lover ties a blue thread around a wrist and says a start will see it when the ship leaves. A midwife washes hands in water scented with mint and prays to Eshmun that the cord will not tangle. A carpenter sets a beam and thinks, not of the pharaohs for whom his grandfather's grandfather planed cedar, but of the shade his daughter will enjoy at noon. Evenings, the city loosens. Storytellers arrive with the caravans and tell tales of a hero who strangled lions and a god who slept on a pyre and woke unburnt, and the children look sideways at the temple of Melkart and feel that the story sits there like a candle that will never go out. Sailors swap lies that make truth bigger, not smaller. A Greek recites a new poem whose vowels feel like small lamps along a dark road. An old woman sings to the courtyard moon while shell heaps in the dye quarter glow pale, almost snow-like, under starlight. Dogs bark in the alleys. A brazier on a rooftop shows two silhouettes leaning very close. The alphabet, rolled up on a shelf, waits for morning and the next day's promises. If you ask what binds this society, the answer comes in gestures, the way a foreman touches the lintel of a workshop with 2 fingers when he enters, the way a sailor spits into the sea before he drinks from it, the way a mother presses a coin into a child's palm and says, "Spend it like a name." The gods are present in all this, not as thunder but as grammar. They make sentences possible. They make agreements mean something when the wind forgets to be fair. In time, envoys will come with imperial accents, and the cities will learn again the discipline of tribute. Assyria will count and punish, Babylon will boast and brood, Persia will organize and reward. Under each, the social order adjusts like rigging under a new wind. The elites survive by becoming useful, the makers survive because empires need what they know, the divers survive because the sea does not ask whom you serve when it asks for skill. Priests translate foreign titles into local dignity. The alphabet finds itself employed on coins with kings' faces. The city remains itself by doing what it always did, negotiating everything, from the price of fish to the shape of fate. And within each life the same simple heroism repeats: get up, honor, count, make, mend, promise, risk, return. The sea is not kind, it is fair by its own arithmetic. Society teaches children how to show up for that arithmetic with something more than luck. War comes to ports first as rumor, then as pricing, then as shadows on the horizon. In a place that lives by arrival, the difference between a convoy and a squadron is the difference between a harvest and a fire. The Phoenicians learned to read that difference quickly. Raiders made small economies of fear, light craft nosing into coves at dawn, oars muffled, blades ready to turn a moored merchantman into a floating market of plunder. Cities answered with breakwaters that were also teeth, with chains that could be hauled across a mouth of harbor, with watchtowers that taught the eye to measure distance in minutes to impact. In alley shrines, offerings changed flavor, not only the steady thanks of trade but vows made with the sharp breath of those who expect steel. Policy handled the rest. A harbor is a statement, and treaties are the grammar that keeps statements from becoming shouts. Cities agreed on weights and redress, on who could winter where, on how to arbitrate insult so that insult did not multiply into feud. When neighbors were reasonable, reason ruled; when they were not, the oarlocks were greased at night. In that long middle stretch between 1000 and 700 BCE, the coast prospered under this dance of reciprocity and readiness. But the inland powers were waking, and their waking had the sound of hooves and the geometry of siege ramps. Assyria's shadow fell first and longest. Ashurnasirpal too came down like weather around the mid-9th century, and even his courtesy was a lesson. Tribute was the price of being left alone to keep making money. Sidon, Tyre, Byblos, Arwad, names recited in Assyrian annals like ports of call in a hymn to order, sent timber, silver, colored cloth, and, perhaps most importantly, acknowledgement. Shalmaneser III counted the same cities among his contributors, and the habit of paying to be unbroken took root. But the coast was never simply meek. It was clever. Tribute bought time, time bought ships, ships bought options. The cities learned the analytic art of empire management, when to bend, when to stall, when to promise a gift that will take 2 seasons to prepare and therefore 2 seasons to postpone consequences. Tyre, the island with 2 harbors like 2 hands, refined defense into a craft. Its sea walls rose sharp from the water, as if the island had learned to be its own cliff. Attempts to starve the place into submission met a city that could fish from its own base and smuggle under the nose of blockades with weather and nerve as allies. Shalmaneser V threw a net around Tyre in the late 8th century. The net held mostly air. Sargon too boasted at distance. Sennacherib's attentions leaned heavier inland. Esarhaddon cracked Sidon instead, stormed it, leveled it, renamed the site in his own honor, deported those he could catch. A warning hung like a sign at the gate of the sea. The lesson was severe but local: assert, yes, survive, always. Tyre's king later found himself besieged, his waterlines cut, his pride made into a leash. Yet even then the island's calm was a stubborn theology: we are made of harbors, we can breathe where others drown. Babylon followed with a slower, heavier tread. Nebuchadnezzar too laid his long siege to Tyre, year after year of tents on the shore facing stone in the water, a calendar of frustration weathered into policy. Mainland old Tyre suffered, the island endured. In the end, the compromise tasted like victory to both sides because exhaustion is a negotiator. The city kept its walls, paid its dues, moved on, because a port cannot afford to dwell in yesterday's fear. It must inventory today's wind. Then Persia rearranged the map without erasing it. Cyrus and his heirs did not demand sameness, they demanded service. The Phoenician cities paid tribute, minted handsome silver, and, above all, gave the empire the talent it needed: ships, sailors, pilots whose knowledge of capes and currents could be made imperial property by oath instead of by conquest. When Cambyses wanted Egypt, Phoenician keels helped him open the delta. When the Persian kings turned their eyes toward the Greek mainland, Sidonians and Tyrians led squadrons, their ships counted among the best. At Salamis, in that tight blue theater where Or met Or and rams wrote laws into hulls, Phoenician skill met Greek nerve, and Greek nerve, that day, wrote the louder story. But empires do not end with one sea battle. The cities return to their habit: be useful, be loyal enough to sleep well, keep your sanctuaries lit, keep your ledgers clean. The Persian arrangement had its own storms. In the mid-4th century, when Egypt tempted Sidon with the mathematics of revolt, King Tens gambled. He paired with Artaxerxes' enemies, tested the empire's appetite for disobedience, and learned too late that appetite can change by the hour. When Persian armies came back in earnest, Sidon chose fire rather than capture. Houses were fed to their own fuel, courtyards became pyres, thousands perished with the terrible efficiency of people who believed that the worst fate was humiliation. The ash settled on treaty stones and on the reliquaries of gods who had watched too many days like this. The coast absorbed the grief as it had absorbed so many tides, by continuing. But the burn mark remained a warning in the city's stone. Westward, cousins fought under another name. Carthage, the daughter who became a queen, carried the Phoenician method into Sicilian and Italian wars, the same mixture of harbor logic and hired steel. There were Greek tyrants on that island who understood ships almost as well. There were battles where the sea shook its head at both sides. Pride, in those western waters, learned to be patient, and industry learned to wear armor. For the eastern homeland, those wars were distant thunder, interesting and instructive, a reminder that Phoenician genius could be both commercial and martial when the sea required. In every age, the city's defenses were a variation on their central idea: make war to your ally. Chain booms across narrow mouths so that a night raid meets iron instead of quiet. Build moles that turn surf into gentleness but hide, beneath their calm, a channel known only to pilots. Keep galleys tuned, they are factories that happen to move. Train marines who can fight on deck and on quay, with spear or boarding hook, who can turn a merchantman into a sudden platform of violence. Make this readiness a normal expense, like salt and olive oil, so that war does not have to be invented anew each time rumor grows teeth. And yet, an enemy came who did not believe that the sea set limits. He arrived with a biography still being written, a young king whose confidence moved ahead of him like a spear tip. After Issus in 333 BCE, Macedon's Alexander descended the coast not as a raider but as a rewriter of arrangements. Byblos and Arwad, measuring the wind, opened their gates. Sidon, rebuilt and wise, calculated that survival under a new master looked like dignity. The treaties were signed in the soft light of afternoon. Alexander asked at Tyre for a simple thing wrapped in a complicated demand, to enter the island and sacrifice to Melkart, Heracles to Greek ears. It was theatre and policy both. The Tyrians, stone calm, offered him a proxy sacrifice from their mainland, honoring his god while refusing his presence inside their sea-ringed sanctum. It was a refusal crafted to keep principle and peace. Alexander's reply was to make geography negotiable. He ordered a causeway thrown into the sea. Stone from the mainland, rubble from murdered suburbs, timber lashed in, earth tamped, the mole grew like a sentence from shore to island, straightforward and obscene in its denial of water's sovereignty. Tyre answered as an island answers, with fire and wit. They sent 5 ships, old hulls packed with resin and pitch, set alight and pushed by a good wind straight into the clustered siege towers on the unfinished mole. The towers flamed up as if they had been waiting their whole lives to become beacons. Macedonian crews leapt into water that bit with heat. Smoke wrote itself against the sky in sanctuaries. Priests argued with the god in voices that shook. Alexander did not stop. He learned, adapted, aggregated power the way a city aggregates rumor. From Sidon and Byblos and Arwad, and then from Cyprus, whose kings were usually prudent, he called a fleet to his hand. Suddenly the island that had always had one more option than its besiegers found itself ringed by those same skills turned hostile. Ships with towers bolted to their decks nosed in toward the walls. Archers and engineers rained arguments of flame and stone. Rams mounted on floating platforms battered the places where stone had grown too used to invincibility. Underwater divers went to work on the besiegers' side now, cutting nets, sabotaging anchors, harvesting the same dark knowledge Tyre's men had held for centuries and selling it to the highest bidder, conquest. The breach came with the logic of physics and the cruelty of legend. When a panel in a wall finally moves, the opening is not only stone, but is permission. Macedonian assault teams swarmed, ladders went up, gates were smashed from within, the 2 harbors became mouths for wolves. Fighting spilled through streets that had been built for shade and argument, not for slaughter. We can be precise about dates and names and still fail to measure the noise. Door beams used as barricades, rooftop-to-rooftop missiles where olives had dried last season. A woman's scream that sounds like a boy's, the dull, recurring sound of iron on cedar. When it was finished, the island had been turned into a stage for victors' proclamations. Many were killed, many more were sold, enough were spared to keep memory alive. The mole that had made a peninsula of a city remained, a scar of empire turned into geography. Melkart's temple received the sacrifice it had been meant to avoid, and whether the god approved, only the wind could say. That conquest taught everyone watching that the arithmetic had changed. A navy could be assembled by command where once it had been gathered by contract. An island city could be pulled to the mainland by will and rock. The remaining ports did not have to be taught a second time. They opened and negotiated, and the negotiations were largely accepted, because Alexander's ambition ran farther than any harbor. He wanted Egypt's ceremony and Persia's breadth. He wanted to stitch the world into a single cloak and wear it as if it had always been his size. The Phoenician cities became, for a time, polished gems in that garment, useful, flattered, tightly held, their god names translated into Greek with a new fluency. It would be dishonest to pretend that war did not also professionalize them. Under Persia they had learned to run a fleet under someone else's flag. Under Alexander they learned to carry the same skills into a new administration without changing the grain of their work. Mariners signed on, pilots led, shipwrights built for paymasters whose statues wore different noses. The discipline of a port is to administer change without wasting motion. Even as garrisons settled in and officials wrote in letters with different angles, the harbors still needed sweeping, the markets still needed fish, the sanctuaries still needed lamps trimmed at dawn. From a longer view, the coast's politics had been a series of rehearsals for this moment. Assyria taught tribute and the art of surviving menace. Babylon taught endurance and the mathematics of siege. Persia taught federation, the way a far capital can be a partner if you make yourself indispensable. Alexander taught the physics of will. Through all of it, the Phoenicians kept the same strategic presumption: water is our friend, unless someone learns to make it otherwise. Their failure at Tyre was not a repudiation of that doctrine, it was the doctrine meeting an exception and surviving everywhere else. Other wars had written smaller scripts on their walls. City against city for rights to a fishery, arguments over anchorages that escalated into night fighting and a season of funerals, inland coalitions that tried to tax the sea with spears and learned that currents collect coin, not proclamations. Yet the coast rarely bled itself dry. It preferred profit to pride and made a habit of turning enemies into clients by offering the thing that enemies eventually want: predictable delivery. The tools of policy in such a world were practical. Hostages as guests with very fine rooms and carefully counted privileges. Intermarriage that tied a treaty to a nursery. Sanctuaries whose pan-Mediterranean cousins gave truce lines room to breathe. Arbitration by foreign cities that profited most from peace. Collective punishment for pirates, so that no harbor was tempted to shelter them for short-term gain. Uplands fed the ports grain, the ports fed the uplands every other desire. The compact could be tender or tense, but it functioned, century on century, because everyone had learned what everyone else did well. In the day-to-day of conflict, there were gestures the city made over and over again until they felt like prayers. Closing the sea gate at night so that no boat left without a name, counting oars not by sound but by the thickness of water around them, drilling men in boarding tactics until timber remembered feet. Children learned to tell the difference between the sound of a convoy coming home and the sound of a war fleet passing through. Dogs learned it too. The gods, for their part, wore expressions that looked like attention. Melkart's calm was never indifference, Astarte's bright gaze did not blink when fireships burned, Bul-Shamam's high, empty blue was the roof under which all promises live or die. If you stood on the Tyrian mole after the conquest and looked back at the mainland, you could read the century just past in layers of stone. The earliest rubble whispered of Assyria, the heavier courses muttered Babylon, the smoother, measured lifts suggested Persia, the final reach, where the water still licked at the flanks and salt dried white in the cracks, said Macedon in a voice like iron. But the sea said something older, that every empire is a tide, and tides, however confident, keep appointments with the moon. And so war, which had arrived as rumor, departed as administration. Garrisons do what rulers cannot: they collect taxes, adjudicate disputes, enforce curfews, and teach boys to curse in a new language. The cities adjusted the way they always had, by making themselves necessary. Alexander's officers needed pilots, pilots came with opinions and maps came with families and temples and markets. The conqueror's needs made space for the conquered's habits. Policy became once again the art of living between someone else's ambitions. After conquest, the sea did what it always does: it kept moving. Garrisons changed the accents of commands on the mole, statues grew new noses, coin dies learned new profiles. But the deeper architecture, the habits that had let a thin coast balance empires and weather, did not vanish. They infiltrated the future like tide through pilings. If you could listen hard enough in any harbor of the centuries to come, you would hear a Phoenician sentence completed in another tongue. Begin where memory meets matter. On the mainland facing Tyre, the mole that carried Macedon across the water refused to unmake itself. Wave by wave, century after century, it armored into permanence. What had been an island became a promontory, geography remembering a siege as if it were a new kind of limestone. Men walked dryshod where pilots once read currents, children played on a victory that had turned into a street. Stone kept the record no library could amend. Across the Middle Sea and out through the pillars, place names held on like barnacles of meaning. Gadir wore its new pronunciations as coddies and still answered to the old logic, a market tutored by tide and channel. Malacca, Malaga, kept the scent of salt and fish pressed into its name. Motia left a ghost lattice in the lagoon, Panormus became Palermo and kept both arms open, Nora was a memory drawn on Sardinia's skin. Carthage, Cartadat, the new city, rose, burned, and rose again as legend and lesson. Carthago Nova, Cartagena, multiplied the idea and sailed it into Roman time. The map itself is a palimpsest where Phoenician handwriting shows through every later script. Then the alphabet. That quiet revolution never stopped echoing. Greeks took the consonant bones and hung clear vowels on them like lamps. Poets found that epics weighed less when carried by 20-odd signs. Philosophers discovered that you could fold an argument into a line of letters and send it across water faster than a messenger could run. Italic hands copied the Greek and taught it law, Latin chisels made it behave on stone. Republics and emperors would later pretend they had invented the trick of turning thought into transport. Eastward, the family multiplied differently. Aramaic, sister to the Phoenician tongue, paired and rounded the letters until they flowed like water, and from Aramaic, scripts walked wide. Hebrew, Nabatean, later Arabic, each with its own musculature but sharing the same ancestral competence, a small kit of signs that any child could master and any empire could use. In markets and chancelleries from the Euphrates to the Atlantic, the economy of writing itself, the refusal to make pictures when sounds would do, was the Phoenician gift that kept paying interest. Sealaw remembered them. Practices honed on Levantine quays, the cool arithmetic of a general average, of jettisoned cargo shared as loss by all so that the ship might live, the bottomry loan that made the sea a silent partner in risk, the sanctity of harbors as neutral ground when storms of politics broke, moved into Greek statutes, into Roman compilations, into the long medieval handshake that let Genoa and Venice inherit a kind of memory without needing to know the names of those who first shaped it. Where later codes cite Rhodes, the water beneath that law still whispers Sidon and Tyre, the reasoning is older than the parchment. Materials kept their power long after the hands that made them were dust. Tyrian dye remained the color of command, the purple that draped senators and emperors and bishops, that sanctified ceremony with the suggestion of dusk, and even when chemistry found cheaper shadows, the phrase "born to the purple" stayed to bless or mock those who inherited a throne. Glass, once the clever child of sand, plant ash, and heat in Phoenician furnaces, evolved into bottles, windows, beads. It learned to be transparent, then transparent with purpose, and across centuries it let light be harvested and stored. A piece of ancient core-formed glass, striped in blues that remember evening seas, sitting in a modern museum's soft light, is not an artifact, it is a line of descent. Agriculture in the West remembers a Punic book. In Carthage, Mago wrote a treatise on fields and vines, on grafting and storage, on the behavior of olives and the patience of soil. Rome burned the city but spared the text, had it translated, and kept the parts that mattered to a people who loved order in their orchards as much as in their laws. The wisdom of a coastal empire that made its living from harbors leaked inland and forward, teaching hands that had never seen Tyre's twin basins how to respect a tree's mood. A dead city taught living farmers to prune. Religion learned to speak in synonyms. Melkart and Heracles looked at each other across cult statues and found themselves familiar, founder gods who carried strength without bragging, patrons of thresholds and journeys. Astarte and Aphrodite shared mirrors and lamps, Eshmun and Asclepius traded tools in sanctuaries where water moved like careful thought, Resheph and Apollo understood the mathematics of plague and precaution. This was not theft, it was calibration. Gods, like trade, prefer bridges to walls when the cargo is compatible. In Carthage, Tarnit sign, triangle, bar, circle, migrated onto stele like a signature that meant heard and answered. Even when polemic later tried to make foreignness frightening, the old equivalences held in the habits of prayer. Scripture, too, kept fingerprints. Kings inland built with cedar that had traveled over water because Phoenician pilots knew the ethics of a raft. A temple rose whose beams smelled faintly of the coast. Letters in sacred texts sometimes still wear the Phoenician names, Arla for the ox whose head once tilted on the shard, Beth for the house. You can feel the oldest carpenter's square inside the word. When prophets denounced Tyre's pride, they did so in a vocabulary learned from the very economy they critiqued. When Lamentations pictured merchants and ships as figures in a moral play, they bet on the audience's intimate knowledge of invoices and tides. Even their defeats fertilized the future. Carthage fell in 146 BCE under Roman persistence, and the West learned an unforgettable lesson about what happens when a state with port habits turns to face a land power that loves roads and ranks. Hannibal's genius, his unfashionable insistence that a war could be waged by thinking like water over land, his elephants as a rumor-given tusks, did not save the city, but it gave generations an image of audacity shaped by the sea. Rome salted fields in anger and fear, yet later, when the empire wanted granaries and theatre and baths where a burned harbor had been, it rebuilt on Punic stone as if admitting that geography outlasts policy. Archaeology keeps finding them in the ordinary. Lead anchors whose holes still hold memories of rope, amphorae stamped with marks that could be read by anyone who had learned the signs, shipwrecks whose cargoes are inventories of taste, wine with the resin of a particular pine, oil that remembers one hillside, gold earrings hammered thin as breath. In graves at Sidon, sarcophagi carved with foreign styles talk about trade in the language of grief. In Cadiz, a brief Phoenician inscription on a plaque under a church floor smiles at all the later words said above it. Museums display these things for the eye, the mind uses them as receipts. The social grammar survived administration. Under the Seleucids and Ptolemies, then Rome, the Phoenician cities became Hellenistic and then Roman without ceasing to be themselves. Greek grew loud in markets and theatres, Latin learned to invoice, coins wore emperors, but the courtyard still answered to wind, the two-harboured city still thought in pairs, guilds still recognized the authority of craft. In the later imperial age, a province would be named Syria Phoenix, a bureaucratic nod to a culture that had long since made the need for such names obvious. Christianity would come by ship, as most new things did. Bishops would debate in halls whose beams had been measured with old tools. Sacred texts would travel in alphabets that owed their bones to men who once wrote cargo lists on potsherds. Beyond law and letters, the Phoenician habit of mind, pragmatic, syncretic, allergic to waste, entered the bloodstream of the sea. Venice and Genoa, Amalfi and Pisa, later the maritime north, all practiced variations on a method first proven where mountains refused to move and harbors did not, keep accounts, make gods of contracts and contracts of gods, prefer treaty to triumph because treaty repeats, turn even misfortune into clause and custom so that it can be survived next time. The sea taught the lesson, the Phoenicians were the first to write it down as if it were a multiplication table. Not every memory is kind. The shell heaps of purple have their own reproach, a beauty born of 1,000,000 small deaths. The debate over Western sanctuaries and the most terrible vows has not finished. Scholars still argue with fireless passion over charcoal and bone and the semantics of grief. But even here, the legacy lies not in final answers but in the rigor of asking, to what extent does prosperity purchase cruelty, to what extent does fear tint ritual, how do we read our ancestors without excusing or simplifying them? The Phoenicians, who could turn a goat hair rope and a square sail into a reliable appointment between strangers, invite us to read carefully. Lean close to a coin from Sidon, a galley races along one face, a king sits calm on the other. The state promises speed and poise at once. Lean close to a bilingual inscription, the same vow in two tongues, each faithful to its own grammar, both faithful to the shared event. Lean close to a child's ostrakon from a schoolroom, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, the first 3 steps of a staircase that will climb into poetry and law, contracts and songs. No drums beat. This is how the world changes when it prefers method to miracle. Standing at dusk on any Mediterranean breakwater, you can stage the experiment. Watch a freighter slide in, watch a pilot boat meet it with a confidence so mild it looks like affection. Hear the radio, static, code, accent, a modern alphabet performing its ancient trick. Smell diesel and salt and hot stone, and beneath those, if the wind is right, a hint of tar that could as easily be pine pitch. Lights come on along the harbor's curve. Somewhere in the city, a court settles a dispute over damaged cargo with a logic that would not have surprised a scribe in Byblos. Somewhere, a designer chooses a violet so dark it feels like power and calls it imperial without knowing why. Somewhere, a child writes a first letter and discovers that the hand can teach the mouth to remember. So the Phoenicians endure, not as a banner under which anyone still marches, but as a template used by everyone who has anything to do with shores. They invented no metaphysics that could rule continents, no armies that could redraw maps by footfall alone. They invented a way of making distance behave, ships that kept their promises, contracts that traveled without guards, letters that let strangers put the same future into words. They taught the Mediterranean to be a conversation instead of a series of isolated speeches. History likes to end with empires, but this one ends with infrastructure. With peers and practices, scripts and standards, recipes and routes, things that can be inherited without proclamation. And that is perhaps the deepest legacy, a civilization whose glory was designed to be borrowed. The Greeks borrowed letters and made them sing, the Romans borrowed sea law and made it govern, Jews and Christians and later Muslims borrowed the alphabetic habit and made it sacred, merchant republics borrowed the port's ethics and made it policy, modernity borrowed all of it and forgot where it learned the trick. If you walk the old stones in Tyre where the mole meets the island that is no longer an island, listen. The sea has a way of pronouncing names even when we do not hear them. Gubbler, your aid, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, the syllables work their slow work, filing the edges of time. A fishing line trembles, a gull complains, a woman counts coins into a palm and nods, a boat knocks against the quay with a sound that might be the world agreeing with itself. Legacy is not a statue. It is this, the continuing ease with which the present ties its knots. ChatGPT 15s. Under the new Greek daylight of the 3rd to 2nd centuries BCE, the old ports learned a fresh poise. Greek became the voice of theatre and decree, Phoenician stayed the language of warehouses, family jokes, and vows muttered at the waterline. Tyre struck coins that paired a fast galley with a calm god, Heracles on one side, who was still Melkart in the innermost rooms of the shrine. Sidon silver kept the long, low hull racing across its face as if money itself were a ship. Byblos, gubbler that had once rafted cedar for pharaohs, grew comfortable hosting Greek schools while its temple precincts still smelled of very old incense. In the countryside above Sidon, Eshmon's sanctuary continued to run water over stone for the sick and hopeful. The basins held a sky that reflected empires without belonging to them. Scribes switched scripts as easily as pilots switch channels, Greek for contracts with governors, Phoenician for letters to uncles in Arwad, Aramaic for the inland customers who would bring wool, wine, and news. The city plan barely changed because the sea didn't. Quays were resurfaced, not reimagined, moles thickened, warehouses grew an extra story or two, a gymnasium appeared beside an older market and the two argued politely over afternoons. The cult equivalences that had once been useful diplomacy became habit, for Melkart Heracles, Astarte Aphrodite, Eshmon Asclepius. On festival nights you could watch a procession whose music was Levantine, whose masks were Greek, whose prayers switched tongues without losing their aim. Children learned Homer under teachers who bought their lamp oil from glassmakers whose grandfathers had blown core-formed flasks in the old style. The alphabet that the coast had set adrift came back as literature, as law, as poetry that could be recited on moles while triremes knocked their slow applause against the stone. Carthage, meanwhile, lived twice. first as thunder, then as echo that filled the room. Rome broke her in 146 BCE and salted the memory. Then, reluctantly honest about geography, Rome rebuilt the place as Colonia Aelia Concordia Carthago. Grain from Africa Proconsularis began to feed the capital the way cedars had once fed Egypt, dependency disguised as pride. Streets were redrawn to the Roman square, theatres and baths grew like orderly vines, aqueducts stepped across the hills. But even Rome's geometry could not erase what Punic hands had learned. The countryside around the city kept its old efficiencies: terraced hills, winter wheat that woke at the right rain, olives that remembered hands trained by Mago's lost book. The treatise survived in Latin pieces and habits: graft this way, plough that way, store amphorae here where cool air behaves. It was a coastal intelligence rerouted inland. Language took its time to leave. Punic, Libophoenician on Roman tongues, was still spoken in markets, in farmyards, in lullabies well into late antiquity. A North African bishop could scold his flock for using it and be understood. In inscriptions, Latin declared the empire; in graffiti and nicknames, Punic declared the neighborhood. Religion pivoted and kept walking. The sign of Tarnet thinned into ornament, basilicas rose where sanctuaries had watched the wind, bishops argued with a fierceness old temple lawyers would have recognized. Tertullian thundered in a Latin that had learned how to scold like a sea storm. Cyprian died with Roman clarity and Punic stubbornness. Augustine, writing from Hippo, braided Greek questions into an African patience that had measured droughts and harvests for centuries. The ports listened as they always had and sold good fish on feast days. Back east, Seleucids faded, Ptolemies narrowed to the Nile, and Rome's long administration settled like a lid that mostly kept the pot from boiling over. A new provincial name, Syria Phoenix, filed the coast into a drawer where it could be found. Latin milestones measured inland roads, sea lanes hardly noticed the change. The old cities added theatres, colonnaded streets, and hippodromes the way a ship adds a fresh coat of pitch, for the season, for appearances, for real. In Tyre you could now sit under shade and watch races in a stadium built where sand had once remembered a siege. In Sidon you could climb from a Roman street to a very ancient stair. In Byblos you could buy a Greek book in a market that still told time by the wind. What endured most sturdily was the method, the port city habit of turning a rival into order. It slipped into Rome's bloodstream and stayed there long after emperors forgot its source. Maritime law that had matured at Rhodes under Phoenician tutelage found itself summarized in Roman books: the device of general average, the shared loss that saves the common ship, outlived gods and governments because it agreed with the sea. Contracts for bottomry and respondentia kept assigning risk to water as if Neptune were an accountant. Glass went on learning new tricks: window panes that made interior light civil, flasks so thin they could tremble. Later, in far centuries, lenses that taught the sky to confess. Purple stayed a decision rather than a color. If you wanted to walk this ghost map now, you would begin at dawn in Byblos. The harbor is small, stone quiet, fishing boats fuss and sway. Beyond them, the ruins layer themselves like a lesson in how to survive: Bronze Age walls, a temple court that remembers pharaohs, a crusader castle with a view that has not learned a new language in 3,000 years. You would read a few letters on a weathered stone: Aleph, Bet, a scratch of Gimel, and feel the tug of a script that turned breath into portable law. Drive south with the sea at your elbow, and Sidon will offer you fruit piled in markets that have never stopped negotiating, and, upriver, Eshman's precinct where cool water still rehearses its old argument with fever. Tyre asks for longer time. Walk out onto the causeway that Macedon made into geology. The city that was an island is firmly attached now, as if the sea agreed to a compromise it privately resents. To the north, the Al-Base necropolis keeps its silence in stone. To the south, the hippodrome curves like a paused wave. If wind is up, Tyre will sting the afternoon in the old Phoenician way. Buy bread with sesame, listen to a fisherman swear at a knot, and you will hear, behind Arabic vowels, an older cadence. Ports pronounce certain words alike in every century. Take a leap west. On Sicily's west coast, a low boat will carry you to Motia's island, San Pantaleo, where Punic streets rest under salt-bright grass and a sacred pool mirrors clouds the way it once mirrored a god. At Solonto above modern Santa Flavia, a Punic Greek-Roman grid climbs a hill and the view explains 300 years of argument. Cross to Sardinia and stand in Nora with your feet in warm water and your eyes on pillars that line the shore like the ribs of a quiet beast. In Tharos the same ribs, a little whiter, a little more patient. In Spain, Cadiz wraps the old Phoenician headland with modern docks. The cathedral's weight does not chase away the scent of salt. If you go at first light, the market will teach you that fish still have names older than menus. South again to Tunisia, where Carthage is a set of widely spaced memories that agree to be a city when you look at them together. Bursa Hill offers a view that empires coveted. The Antonine baths remind you that Rome loved water almost as much as Tyre loved stone. In the Tophet at Salambo the debate over vows and bones continues in the hush that archaeologists favor and tourists do not break. Further south and east, at Kirkuane on Cap Bon, a whole Punic town sits as if it had only just exhaled, streets with drains cleverer than pride, houses with black and white floors, pink mortar that learned to shrug off salt. The sea hisses and praises these choices, which were not glamorous and therefore lasted. If you're fetish for islands, put them on Ibiza. The necropolis of Puig des Molins keeps thousands of quiet rooms where Evis's first Phoenician and Punic settlers lay their dead, walk among the fig trees and listen for a scribe's soft curse at a broken stylus. On Cyprus, at Kition, Larnaca, the blocks of the Phoenician temple still weigh the sun. In Malta, at Tarsil above Marsic's Lock, a sanctuary changes names across centuries while insisting on the same hill, the same view of boats turning into dots. What you carry home from such an itinerary is not a legend but a competence. The sense that civilizations can be built out of repeated gestures that do not tire, loading, unloading, weighing, writing, promising, repairing, teaching children the names of winds and letters. The Phoenicians' genius was to prefer these gestures to the ecstasy of conquest. When conquest came, they rented it hulls. When gods changed names, they lit the lamps anyway. When alphabets multiplied, they kept using all of them. And the story keeps throwing echoes forward. A medieval notary in Amalfi rules on a jettisoned cargo with language that leans back toward Sidon. A Renaissance glassblower in Murano turns a gather that remembers a furnace on the Levant. A modern pilot in Cadiz brings a ship through a tide race with a calm any Tyrian would nod at. A printer in Rome sets Latin letters with Phoenician bones and calls it simply a font. People born to the purple no longer wear murex, but the phrase will not retire. Somewhere a child in school traces an A and a B and does not know that he has just rehearsed the beginning of Cadmo's path. If there is a moral, it is not bronze. It is cedar plain thin and true, rope tarred against weather, a script trimmed to the minimum that still sings, a port that can welcome and defend. The Levant taught these things to itself first, then to everyone else. By the time Alexander walked his causeway across the water, the lesson had already spread too far to be stopped. You can conquer cities, it is harder to conquer a method. ChatGPT 12s. Dusk folds over the Levant and the sea inhales. On the Tyrian causeway, stone that once was strategy and is now a street, children race shadows while nets dry like grey wings. Cedar breath lingers in the shipyards, pitch warms in pots, a pilot's thumb rests on the grain of a tiller as if reading a familiar page. The harbours speak in rope and gull and bell, a galley's oars feathering the water, a fisherman laughing at a knot that finally remembers its duty, a money change accounting silver by sound as much as by weight. Out beyond the breakwater, the horizon is a long, level promise. Lanterns wink to one another along the quay, a necklace of small suns tying city to sea. Somewhere a priest lights a brazier before dawn's last blue is gone. Somewhere a glassmaker turns a gather at the lip of the furnace until the molten globe accepts a future. The alphabet sleeps in a jar with reed pens, 20-some signs curled like tame serpents, ready to rise and travel. Rain once taught these coasts their limits and their liberties. Before the wars with proper names, men felled cedars where mist combed the mountains and sent them south as floating architecture. Byblos bartered seasons to Egypt, rafts stitched from trunks, pilots who could read tide by color, contracts sealed with a goddess who wore different jewelry depending on who visited. On a smooth sherd, a hand sketched an ox head, then a house, then a camel. Pictures so paired they became pure function, breath turned into marks that could survive the weather. Winter storms rehearsed shipwrights in humility, summer calms rehearsed them in nerve. Springs braided into rills, rills into streams, streams into coves that asked to be called harbors. Between cliff and surf, villages learned the grammar of staying small without being poor. When the Bronze Age buckled, the coast did not, it had been practicing the art of continuing. The first true sentence in this language was simple: make what others want, carry it farther than they can, but it held the weight of empires before empires noticed. Craft answered with mastery that astonished. In dye yards that steamed like tame reefs, divers' harvest bled from green to bruise to a purple so calm it made kings nervous. In furnaces, sand and ash forgot themselves and became sky you could hold, striped blues remembering a particular evening. Weavers lofted linen that moved like water and wool that kept its oaths. Bronze casters cracked molds to reveal lions that seemed to have learned to breathe underwater. A ship grew outward from a keel the way a poem grows from meter. Mortise met tenon, pegs kissed tight, seams drank pitch, ribs rose, planks smoothed until a hand could read them like a list of good years. On the counting board, shekel stones, smooth, honest, made strangers agree. Weights were reputations, seals were voices that could speak when their owners slept. Roots braided out, Cyprus copper to Iberian silver, Rhodes wine to African salt, tart Sardinian metal to soft Sicilian grain. Squared sails snapped, horse-headed prows lifted at the edge of a swell, and pilots took the Pleiades for companions because the stars kept appointments better than kings. Society kept its liturgy of ordinary greatness. In a courtyard smelling of wet stone and bread, a girl scratched Aleph, Bet, Gimel on a broken sherd while her mother threaded a loom with patience that looked like prayer. In the yard of Eshman, water stepped through basin smooth as old vows, a healer's hand smelled of mint and resin and clean linen. Divers practiced breath against a wall, stone weights heavy against their chests, each descent a negotiation with time. A scribe of a bee among houses carried wax tablets between people who needed their future to match. Slaves set free bought tools they already knew how to use and became neighbors. Priests were actuaries with incense, sail after the festival, the winds remember then, they advised, and when fever came, Reshepha's quarantine wore a god's teeth so it could bite through impatience. On feast nights, Melkart walked the city's edges as a ring of fire and everyone slept better, not because the god patrolled, but because the community had rehearsed its courage. War arrived like weather and policy at once. Watchmen saw it before anyone believed it, too many sails, wrong geometry. Chains rose across a harbor mouth, masts were struck, a quiet orbit took the city's pulse. Assyria counted ports as assets and punished them as examples, Babylon settled to siege like a stone on a chest, Persia federated skill, asking for ships and giving room to worship. Then a young Macedonian refused to let water set the limits of will and threw a road at an island until geography admitted defeat. Fireships answered, towers burned, divers cut, rams argued with walls, and when the breach widened from physics to permission, an old confidence learned humility. Yet even there, amidst smoke and iron, the sea taught its stubborn lesson, causeways become streets, wars become administration, and the port, because it must, returns to the work of being useful. Treaties remembered names, harbor chains were called again, oars were counted anew by the thickness of water. Legacy traveled in things that prefer repetition to spectacle. The alphabet's modest kit became poetry's instrument and law's machine, Greeks hung vowels on it like lamps, Latin straightened its posture, Aramaic rounded it into a script that would teach markets and scriptures how to move. Maritime law, born in ledger and storm, codified fairness, jettisoned to save the ship, share the loss that saves the common life. Purple turned into a metaphor that outlived chemistry, glass learned to be window, then lens, and eventually a way to persuade light to confess. Carthage died loudly and lived quietly in orchards and books, Mago's agriculture survived in a Roman tongue and in hands that had never heard Punic spoken. In sanctuaries, Melkart and Heracles nodded to each other for centuries, proof that commerce and cult share a love of capable synonyms. A Roman judge in a port cited Rhodian custom with a confidence any Sidonian would have recognized, a medieval notary in Amalfi drew a line through loss with an old arithmetic, a modern pilot in Cadiz brought a container ship through a tide race and called his vector by a star's name without thinking why. Night again on the coast that invented mornings for so many others. Somewhere in Byblos, a reader mouths letters that were once pictures and now are only breath behaving. Somewhere in Sidon, a fishmonger salts mullet and quotes his grandmother. Somewhere in Tyre, a child counts the lights up the shoreline and thinks each is a story waiting for a word. The sea exhales. The city's answer. The method, make distance behave, let strangers agree, write it down so dawn can find it again, keeps working. Empires march and retire, alphabets travel and settle, piers are repaired, vows are kept, the wind, in season, remembers its obligations. And if you listen at the water's edge, you can still hear the old conversation, soft, deliberate, fluent in many tongues, between horizon and harbor.